Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the Energy Bar Association's president, Bob Weissar.
Good morning, and thank you. I want to welcome everybody to our annual meeting. This is the key event for our EBA year. I encourage you to all have fun during these 2 days. Connect with old friends, meet new friends, especially our new members. Reminder that all sessions today are being recorded for future posting and sharing, so be on your best behavior. If you have not downloaded the meeting app, please do so using Guidebook. It has a list of all meeting attendees, schedule, and so forth. Very helpful. We will have our first EBA TED Talk tomorrow afternoon at 3:15. And I want to note the following special events. There will be an LGBT meetup today at 5 in the hotel lobby. Our CFEBA Gala will be this evening. The reception starts at 5:30. If you have not purchased tickets for that, you can do so at the EBA registration desk. Tomorrow morning, we will have our new member and first-timer coffee at 8:15, and that's at the restaurant in the hotel lobby. And I encourage you to stay for the closing reception tomorrow. That will take place after our former FERC Commissioner panel, which is our last panel of the meeting. Our luncheon speaker today will be Joe Kessler, who is Executive VP and Chief Operating Officer at NYPA. He's had a lot of on-the-ground, boots-on-the-ground experience in Puerto Rico, and he will share that with us during his luncheon remarks. I want to thank our many conference sponsors and exhibitors. They are a key part to our annual meeting success. And I especially want to thank our Professional Education Council. They have met weekly for the last 3 or 4 months preparing this annual meeting, getting speakers together, getting panelists together. They are truly amazing. Stu Kaplan from Troutman Sanders and Damian Leister from Vincent and Elkins served as our co-chairs. Tom Millar from Wilkie Farr and Gallagher and Norman Peterson from Hannah and Morton served as vice chairs. They will become chairs of the Professional Education Council and start preparing for our mid-year meeting in October. Also, a big shout out to Jessica Lynch from Troutman Sanders, who was supportive of the Professional Education Council throughout their preparations. I turn the program now over to Mark Haskell, who will moderate and introduce our first panel. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everybody. This panel is unique. As lawyers, we spend a great deal of time wondering about things. And among the many things we wonder is, what is it that senior executives want? How do they think? What are their priorities? How do they reach those priorities? And today's session can provide you with at least the beginning of an answer. We're pleased to have with us today the President of the Association of Oil Pipelines, Andy Black, the President for Natural Gas Transportation of Tallgrass Energy Partners, LP, Crystal Heater, and the President and CEO of BP Energy Company, Orlando Alvarez. We'd like to kick off the program with Orlando, who's going to provide an overview of fundamental changes in the North American gas market that affect regulatory policies.
Okay, thank you, Mark. First off, yes, it's a room full, and it's actually the first time I've been at the Energy Bar Association, and it was a great opportunity for me to be here, and I thank you for the invite. I'm going to be really quick, and my purpose over the next 10 or 15 minutes is just take you through the landscape. Some of you, this may be old news for you. But in my 31 years in this market, I can tell you we're in unprecedented times. Whether it's the infrastructure, whether it's the supply portfolio that we have, energy, whether it's the demand, whether it's the regulatory, what I would call uncertainty, all the things going on. It is, in my 31 years, it's the first time I've seen it this way. Call it exciting, call it fun, it's still fun, but there's a lot of uncertainty. Before I start, I'm sure all of you are familiar with this. I'm going to provide insights, not advice. These are my insights, not BP's. And again, I'm sure all of us have seen that. So let me start with the current state of the natural gas market. For those of us that have been in the industry for a while, we haven't seen this in a very long time. If you look at this chart from 2016 to 2018, prices have hovered around $3. How many of you remember when it was $10 and $15? Right? How many of you remember when LNG was being imported because we didn't have enough gas supply in North America in 2008? Right? So look what we have now. What you see there is you'll see in the winter of 16 and the winter of 17, you had a move down. You had high inventories, warm winter. All of a sudden in January 17, you had storage levels, you had weather. And then again, January 18, you'll see the big spike. Y'all remember January of 18, I'm sure it was cold up here. So what did you have? You had $6 gas price in the hub, and you had prices in the Northeast close to $100 in MMBTU in January of this year. What's this say? The market, for the most part, has been pretty steady. It shows that we have had a supply response. Supply is in place. We have it. Infrastructure and all that's following. But for now, the market is reacting, and the key message to take away from this is the market does work. We have a reliable market. The other point I wanted to make, the landscape has changed when it comes to the interconnection between all of these commodities. As Mark said, I run BP's North American Marketing and Trading Organization out of Houston. We're pretty much in every one of these commodities. And what I would tell you is one is as linked to the other as never before. So what does that mean? If you have higher oil prices, that's going to be more drilling. Well, higher oil prices, more drilling means more natural gas, associated gas from oil, which is what's happened in Permian, in Eagle Ford, in Marcellus. More gas supply means lower prices. If you have higher oil prices, you also have higher naphtha prices. A lot of the petrochemical plants that crack naphtha are now saying, you know what, I have cheaper ethane because natural gas liquids comes from gas, so now I'm going to start looking at ethane or propane or butane instead of naphtha, right? You have LNG now on the water, so now in the U.S., well, a lot of the historical LNG around the world, especially in Asia, is priced off Brent, crude. Higher Brent means, you know what, they're going to look for other sources of LNG and they're going to come to the U.S. All of these are all interconnected. It's not, you can't look at them in silos if you're looking at energy prices across the world. And actually the last note is, think about it now. And there's another slide in the presentation. LNG, everybody knows about all the LNG facilities that are being built on the Gulf Coast. You now have 3 BCF a day of gas going to 9 by 2020. And these are facilities that are built. What does that do? Creates a global gas market now. So if Russia's supplying Europe, what's that going to do to the LNG back to the U.S.? Where does it go? Australia has a bunch of LNG. It's a global market now that we have to watch. So that's the key message from that slide. So when I call it regulatory uncertainty, and this is a short list, by the way. I could add a lot more to this. I'm sure many, many of you in the room are familiar with a lot of these. I call it uncertainty because some of these are still pending. And whatever comes out of them will have an impact in the market. And as an energy marketer, we're watching this every single day. We have analysts that are watching this every single day. So the first 6 will affect investment in the upstream, right? So then you start looking at, solar panel, steel, aluminum tariffs. That's the new hot one right now, right? We're starting to hear where developers are canceling or delaying and want more certainty before they continue with the projects. The nuclear zero emission credits, New York, Illinois is now putting in place to support nuclear. The DOE NOPR on grid resiliency. So what's going to happen with the coal and nuclear subsidies? Will that happen? What's the impact on natural gas prices if that happens? The rising RPS, renewable power standard. So as more renewables come on, remember the Clean Power Plan was stayed. You have a lot of states that are going forward with their own mandates. What happens there? Some states are saying 50% by 2030, etc. All of this is so important in the market, and is the key point to make. So let's talk about the core fundamentals. That's the landscape. Interconnectivity. You now have a lot of what I call regulatory uncertainty or pending issues. But when you look at the slide, it reinforces where I started. We have enough production in North America, in the U.S. Oil production at 10 million barrels a day. Gas production close to 80 BCF a day. This will show you primarily some of the basins, not all of them. So the gas production there is at 4 basins, 30 BCF a day. Doesn't include Marcellus, which is another 25 or 30 up in the northeast. So again, it's an abundant supply. And remember, with gas and oil comes natural gas liquids. We always sometimes forget the other commodity that comes from gas: ethane, propane, butane. So very important to note that supply is in place. It's here. This slide, it's a busy slide, but it shows, again, for those that have been here a while, you remember the big 3 T-pipes of gas that came out of the Gulf of Mexico into northeast. We had 3 big pipelines that went up, straight to the northeast. Now, you have gas coming from the northeast going west. You have it coming south. You have NGL pipelines out of Marcellus, rich gas, so NGLs are coming down so they can get to Mount Belvieu, which is the NGL hub in Texas, where it trades and it's the most liquid point. You have LPG, which is propane and butane, not to be confused with LNG. You now have LPG on the water. I don't know how many of you knew that. Now you have propane and butane on ships going around the world. You have new terminals being built across the country, along with the LNG. 2 years ago, they moved the first ethane ship out of the U.S. So now you have ethane on ships, which we never even thought of years ago, moving around the world. So the infrastructure is being developed quickly, and there's a lot of it. You have constrained basins, for instance, right now, Permian, a lot of oil, a lot of gas, not enough infrastructure, and we'll get to some of that, but I think there's 3 oil pipelines, 5 gas pipelines being built out of Permian. Another important slide with RPS and everything we just talked about, to state the obvious, but wind, solar developments are coming on very quickly. You'll see coal and nuclear retirements. We've seen them over the last 2 or 3 years and more. Why? Lower gas prices. So now you have lower fuel and less emissions with gas. And so the market is again working, and you're starting to see quite a bit of this across the country. So this one talks about, for the first time, that the U.S. is a net exporter of natural gas. So the blue bar is the net of Canadian. We were so reliant on Canadian gas coming into the country. Well, you now have gas you don't have all this northeast gas, and the U.S. is abundant supply. We don't need all the Canadian gas. and some of it is actually constrained. You need more infrastructure out of the West. So what this shows is by 2020, the blue bar is the net Canadian in and Mexico out. So by 2020, we're exporting gas. And then the orange is all the LNG that we just talked about. It's quite a turnaround. Mexico, which I know was a topic for discussion that we're going to get into a bit more. Mexico, the energy reform over the last 3 or 4 years, and I've been a big part of that and watching that. We're selling gas into Mexico as we speak. This is now at about 3 BCF or so, and it could double in the next couple of years with a number of pipelines being built. Kinder Morgan's there. There's an offshore pipeline. TransCanada is building pipelines all the way into the country. Because right now what we have is right at the border, but there's pipelines we need gas pipelines all the way into the south of the country. So this is a very big pull on natural gas from the U.S. Remember, now you have Mexico, you have LNG, you have an industrial growth in the Gulf Coast. You have a number of petrochemicals that are being built, industrial plants. It's quite an impressive turnaround. Okay, so where does this go? So we started where prices were, so where do we go now? With everything you've heard. Supply is abundant, demand is also coming on. So it's not just that we have a supply, but we have some big demand sinks for natural gas and NGLs. And now crude's a global market as well. So it's not just that we have this abundant supply, but we also have the demand being built. Now, will the infrastructure keep up? That's the key. In my summary slide, we'll hit on that in a minute. But this tells you where the market is. This is what the market is telling you, is showing. Natural gas prices, the black line there is what the curve is today, going through 2022. Right at $3 for the next 5 years. The dotted line is a year ago, that curve. Hasn't moved very much, has it? And then the gray is a number of external consultants and what they think the range is. So who would have thought that, heck, 3 years ago? The market is now that doesn't mean we won't have volatility, and that's the point that I'd make, is that with the infrastructure, the timing of the infrastructure, the regulatory issues, concerns, policies that are pending, whatever you want to call it, the supply and the demand getting pulled, the global connectivity of the market, you will see, just like we did in the first slide, you will see what I would call intra-regional, you'll see intra-month volatility. But for the most part, this is a really good sign, right? This tells you that we've really come a long way in the U.S. when it comes to energy supply. And this is just a summary slide, repeating that. But the one that I would really, again, point is at the first one, which is the market works. I've taken you really quick, 10, 15 minutes of what it looks like. But again, market signals, the price signals create, more drilling, more oil, more gas. Now all of a sudden demand starts coming in because you have lower prices. Demand starts being built. The infrastructure comes after that. So very confident in the fact that the market has been working. Thank you very much.
Crystal?
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for having me here today. Let's see if I can get us, all right. I'm sure it pleases all of you lawyers to see the legal disclaimer here. What I usually do when it's not a room full of lawyers is say, don't worry about this slide. It just means that anything I say you can't hold me to, and we move on. So now you know what we say here. Very quickly, I'd just like to give you a short overview of Tallgrass and who we are. Most of you may know this, but just for a basis here. Tallgrass has 3 business unit segments, and this is our footprint. Our first being the natural gas transportation sector, which has the Tallgrass Interstate System, the Trailblazer Pipeline, and the Rockies Express Pipeline. We also have a crude oil transportation pipeline, Pony Express, and our unregulated segment, which has our gathering and processing, terminaling, and our water business. I'll go through this, or not even going to go through this slide, just a quick reference slide. We may refer back to some of the items here. This is just to show that Tallgrass, as many of the natural gas interstate pipelines, have been very active in responding to the changing dynamics that we are enduring in today's market. Where I'd like to start is with the statement and ask you all to keep in mind that pipelines are not all the same. There are many aspects which differentiate us, and we'll go through a number of them, but the competition, our corporate structure, how we perform, what markets we are serving, how we approach our customer service, what our rate situation is relative to legacy pipelines and new build pipelines, and how those risks are brought about each day. It's been a long-standing principle that competitive markets will determine the need for infrastructure and the risks that come along with those aspects. Competition is beneficial for our consumers. The policy changes that Orlando discussed and that we are all facing inherently bring financial risks and timing risks. What is key to the development of infrastructure is predictability. And as we approach all of the potential changes coming forth, we need to do that with a very measured decision-making approach that will bring predictability to those projects. In recent times, much of the developments in production and the growth in production have caused production to support the pipeline projects coming forth. Market participants need a very early line of sight to the takeaway in order to make their own business decisions. And in responding to that, the infrastructure must deploy significant capital early in the process. The regulatory process comes following there, and it must be efficient and predictable. Excuse me. As I mentioned, there are a number of markets in which the different pipelines operate, and our rate situations differ dramatically amongst us. The supply and demand areas, as Orlando mentioned, have significantly changed. They have shifted, they have turned on their heads, and it's an entirely new world that we're living in today. Pipelines are faced with responding competitively to these changes. We additionally have aging infrastructure issues, which bring new challenges for captive markets that are needing a reliability of service that may not be there today. There's a divergent rate situation with pipelines. Those modern pipelines that have been built in the last 10 to 15 years at a significant cost of capital, competing with legacy pipelines that have been significantly depreciated. That creates a significant gap in those rates and a dramatic difference in the way those pipelines compete. Filling that gap is a cost recovery mechanism. Excuse me, grab a little water. Which is the means for those aging infrastructure projects to bring their integrity plans and their modernization of their pipelines current. They are significantly challenged cost recovery mechanisms. There's a resistance to increasing of rates. But as we go forward, I think we will see even more progress in that regard, and that will bring some convergence of these rate situations. Another major way that pipelines are not the same is in the way they perform and they execute projects. At Tallgrass, we do believe that the current policy and guidelines are effective when they are followed, and when public outreach, early communication, respect for landowners' properties, and proactive engagement, planning, complete applications, all of those aspects are employed, then the regulations can work. However, they're being revised and considered extensively right now, and as we go forth, reasonable decision-making needs to be employed. The good actors in the industry are quickly forgotten when the bad actors get into the spotlight. We all become painted with the same brush, and that's very challenging for a number of the operators. But it's also a challenge to rein in that aspect, as there's a significant commercial push for these commodities to get moved to market. Customer service. Customer service is a very soft aspect of our business, and so we all struggle with that a lot. However, I think there is a cultural shift occurring where shippers truly are coming to value the customer service that they are seeing between different pipeline operators, and their efforts to develop partnerships that bring win-win situations not only to the pipeline, but also to the customers, that we look to provide them with a full cycle service and use creativity and innovation to solve their issues. Additionally, pipelines have historically been thought to stand behind their tariffs and avoid new opportunities for customers. That has not been Tallgrass's approach, and I think more and more pipelines are moving forward to give yes answers to our customers. I want to go through a bit of a specific example. The Northeast, as we mentioned, the Marcellus and the Utica, has been one of the most prominent shifts in the net demand and production basins going on in the U.S. today. Most all of the pipes in this area and serving this area historically have shifted into a bidirectional or new direction protocol. And REX is a classic example of that. We were there early. We built west to east originally. In 2009, we landed in Clarington, Ohio, delivering 1.8 BCF to the Northeast. We basically got to the doorstep to be turned away by the production increases in the Utica and Marcellus. And over the last 4 or 5 years, we have executed several successful projects to bring natural gas back to the mid-continent markets. This has increased our capacity to 4.4 BCF. And in the future, with the unique header location of the Rockies Express pipeline and the other Tallgrass assets, we see that extending even more so for up to 6.2 BCF of gas that can be moved to other interstate pipelines to respond to the dynamic needs of supply and demand shifting in the U.S. Just a quick example to show how much the production and demand growth of the last few years has occurred. The blue here is showing the west to east production out of the Rockies at 1.8 BCF, combined with the new flows from the east at about 2.6 BCF, and both of those aspects are still flowing. The demand growth has been responding to the available supply. It's just going a new direction, and Rockies Express is in a prime position to hit all of the other interstate pipelines and transport that gas. As I said, the Tallgrass system stretching the non-conventional path of west to east, east to west, and intersecting with 40 additional interconnects on our system will allow the flow to the Gulf Coast, to Mexico, to the Northeast, to the West, for LNG export, all of the above, and following weather patterns and the ability to respond to the full demand in the market. In summary, I just want to say again that predictability is key. The timing of the regulatory authorizations must be reasonably predictable. Once a negotiation has moved past the actual service, we spend the most of our time trying to approximate what the regulatory timing will be. That's important to our customers. They are relying on our service. They are making their key business decisions based on that execution period and the regulatory authorizations. The policy changes must be well thought out. They must be implemented cautiously. Any dramatic changes just bring risk and uncertainty to the overall market. And in doing so, as these regulatory changes are employed, it must be recognized that pipelines are not all the same, and a one-size-fits-all solution is not going to work for everyone. There needs to be good guidance that can be applied to the different pipelines. We need to remember that not all pipelines are out there causing destruction. Many pipelines are looking to have partnerships not only with our customers, but with our landowners as well. That there are differences between the legacy and the new pipelines, and that there's differences between competitive markets and captive markets. And with that, we'll turn it over to Andy.
Hey, good morning. I'm Andy Black with the Association of Oil Pipelines, AOPL. It's nice to be here with oil, a chance to speak, nice to see some friends here, and it's nice to speak to a crowd that has a high energy literacy. My favorite anecdote about that is the person who gave thanks to how blessed our country was, that we had naturally occurring supplies of gasoline perfectly positioned at major highway intersections throughout the country. We represent the pipelines that bring crude oil from production areas and natural gas liquids to fractionators. And from those refineries and fractionators go out the products that we use in our daily lives: gasoline, diesel fuel, heating oil, jet fuel, and all the products like propane and ethane that Orlando talked about that are important. You got here today thanks to a pipeline. If you flew here or moved in a car, taxi, Uber, you used a product that flew through a pipeline. Normally, that whole oil and gas transportation cycle is out of sight and often out of mind. It is hurricanes and natural disasters that show us how important it is. Think about Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, Sandy, and of course Harvey. In Katrina and Rita, the problem was power being knocked out to pump stations in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. So what happened? The gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuel that we need in the mid-Atlantic couldn't move. Very quickly, government, consumers, other producers recognized the importance of getting that pipeline back up with power. Sandy, the problem was pipelines often had power, but the terminals didn't, or the terminals were flooded and didn't have access there. And you saw what happened in New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut, lines miles long of people trying to get that product that they need in their daily lives. And then Hurricane Harvey, amazing amounts of water dropped on southeast Texas and western Louisiana. That shows us the importance of government and the private sector working together. And laws and regulations aren't always nimble on the way that we need for governments to help pipeline operators and fractionators and terminal operators and refineries get back operating. I want to commend anybody in this room who was a part of that, from the energy side or the government side. That was a successful story. We had very short windows of time where people were concerned. As we near the next summer, we need to think about being ready for hurricanes. We've learned a lot of lessons from Hurricane Harvey, and we hope that we're able to get the American people what they need, and that there's that recognition from a sector like, from an episode like that, that's important. At AOPL, we have three primary parts of our mission: responsible policies, safety excellence, and public support for liquid pipelines. To this group, what do I mean by responsible policies? Responsible policies on economic and regulatory issues that bring investment into the sector, on capacity expansion issues that allow people to expand, to bring more products to American workers and consumers, on approvals and safety issues. Now, it cannot be said about this administration that it is boring. Nor can it be said that it's a boring time in oil pipelines. I suspect that we'll be talking in the Q&A about FERC and PHMSA and permitting and steel tariffs. To buy some moderator goodwill and audience goodwill, I'll wrap up this comment so that maybe I can go a little longer on some of your questions. But it's a fascinating time right now. Thank you for being a part of the discussion.
Thanks, and Andy, you will definitely get more time. You can have as much time as you like. One thing I'd like to do is pose some questions to the panel. Now, in my questions and in your answers, one thing we will not do, and that is to talk about any contested proceedings pending before the commission on the record. For those of you who are curious about that phrase, I believe there's an ethics component tomorrow night. Andy correctly pointed out that this administration is not boring. Orlando, one question for you. Do you see the larger North American market, the US, Canada, and Mexico, over the next 5 years as becoming more integrated or more balkanized?
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's definitely more integrated. As I covered earlier, so the Canadian, the gas coming into the U.S. from Canada, it was very integrated. It's now backed off because of all the supply that we have in the east, but more pipeline is being built out of Canada to come down into the west. We continue to have more pipelines built out of the U.S. into Mexico. We now have rail coming into Mexico, waterborne products delivering, LNG into east and west country, west side of Mexico. So yeah, I would say you now have Quebec and Alberta looking at our CO2, the California CO2 policies, and looking at doing some of that as well. So I think they're coming together in a much better way, right? Absolutely, more integrated.
But the current discussions about the potential renegotiation of NAFTA could have an impact on that, correct?
Yeah, NAFTA, the new election, you now have landowners and environmental concerns delaying infrastructure in Mexico. So all of this is when the reform came on a year ago, the first third-party gas into Mexico in July of 17. Remember, Pemex and the CFE were the two incumbents. So now it's about, there's a few things. The challenges. One is, being a competitive market. Everything in Mexico is still evolving. Your natural gas prices are still coming out of the U.S. Will they have a regional pricing system? Will the third parties be able to compete with the Pemexes and the CFEs? What will happen if NAFTA occurs? Is infrastructure going to be built the way they say it's going to be built in the time frame that they say it's going to be built? You have offshore pipelines, you've got in-country. There's just a lot going on, and I'd call it uncertain for now.
Okay. And each of the panelists in different ways has mentioned the issue of steel tariffs and how they affect both oil and natural gas pipelines. Could you give the audience a better understanding of what the state of play is right now on steel tariffs? And if you were king of the world, how would you see it resolved?
Boy, the Section 232 steel tariffs issue is really affecting the decisions that pipeline operators and shippers are having to make about projects. It's punishing innocent bystanders. Who are the innocent bystanders? The workers and Americans that are ready to get to work on projects, and the consumers that need the lower cost access to lower cost supplies that pipelines provide. We're hearing anecdotes about foreign pipe makers unwilling to bid in response to requests by American companies for pipeline projects. We're hearing about pipeline operators not knowing what the price of their steel is going to be. We've had a couple of exemptions for certain countries for, 2 months? That helps reduce Wall Street volatility, but that does nothing to help a pipeline operator or a shipper considering signing up for pipeline capacity, who want to know at the end of a multi-year process that's getting longer because of slowed approvals, what's that price of steel going to be then? We have specialty steel products in the in our pipeline process that aren't made in the U.S. We have a lot of American makers who have exited the pipeline steel market for other steel products that have more consistent, have better returns. Pipeline steel is a niche market. It's high cost, it's cyclical, and a lot of American firms have abandoned that to move to those other markets. So now anybody who goes forward on a pipeline project has to factor in a lot more risk.
And as a pipeline operator, that's the challenge, is who is going to hold that risk. At an early part in project development, is the pipeline holding that risk? Is there a negotiation with the shipper built into that project? And it creates a delay in the overall process for infrastructure build-out.
I'll add one more thing on that, Mark, if you can. You asked what should happen. I have great respect for the China-U.S. trade issues that people are trying to deal with, right? Market access to China for American companies, forced joint ventures. protection of intellectual property. But China is a bit player in pipeline steel. There's no reason that our products should be applied tariffs, right? We need real product-specific exclusions to give people the certainty that they need. Those are important issues that the president and his trade team is working on. But those innocent bystanders in the pipeline world really aren't a player in that, and they should be protected.
Each of you, from different perspectives, has talked about fundamental changes in infrastructure and the need for more certainty in connection with the permitting of infrastructure, both for crude oil and NGL pipelines and for natural gas pipelines. At the same time, many of the new infrastructure projects that have been proposed face very organized opposition from environmentalists and others. From your perspective, what policies can most effectively balance the need for new infrastructure with concerns regarding potential environmental impacts? Andy, do you want to start?
I think this one is easy. When it's allowed to work, the existing federal and state permit process does balance infrastructure expansion and environmental protection. Our pipelines, liquid and gas, can generally meet the environmental standards that are a part of these reviews. Our great poster child of a long-delayed pipeline, Keystone XL, right? It satisfied the environmental reviews, even conducted by President Obama's State Department. The EIS showed that compared to alternatives, pipelines have fewer incidents, fewer releases, fewer carbon emissions even. So the permitting process needs to be allowed to work. We need reviews to be fair, timely, decisions to be made on the merits. There are improvements that are possible in regulatory reform. AOPL with API has commented in regulatory reform dockets on Corps of Engineers and Forest Service. We've asked for a consistent application of the rules. We've asked for reviews to stay within scope and agencies to coordinate with each other. There have been some improvements, including at the State Department, which has cross-border approval process that delayed Keystone XL. So when it is allowed to work, pipelines can get to work. We can start giving more access. Right now, we don't need major changes. We just need government and policymakers to be able to withstand the pressure from that well-funded, well-organized minority that is trying to stop people from using fossil fuels in their daily lives and trying to stop pipelines from being approved. If they can stick to what they're asked to look at in these reviews of pipelines, even amidst pressure, we'll be able to deliver what Americans need.
Agreed, and that well-organized aspect is not going anywhere. It will always be there, even when we're allowed to follow the policies and requirements as they're laid forth. Again, I'll say that the more that the pipeline operators can perform well, execute properly, create partnerships with their communities, start with early outreach, and prove that the construction can be handled appropriately, that may alleviate some of the pressure. I don't think it's ever going to alleviate it all. That will be there to some extent, and you're right, that they need to be able to withstand. We all need to be able to withstand that pressure.
So I'll be a little provocative. Imagine that, the energy marketer. So the one thing I think that for me is, and I'm not as close to it as you guys are, but it's better alignment between the federal government and the state. So New York, the Constitution pipeline. I mean, so how does that work? I mean, again, I'm more of a question. To me, that's the way I would summarize it. It's better alignment and leave it at that. But I think, you had a pipeline that was approved, ready to go, and then got delayed. So I think that would be my point.
Well, following up on that, I think that one of the initiatives, again, from a rulemaking perspective, that the Commission has considered, that other agencies have considered, is improving the coordination among federal agencies, at least, in connection with the Commission's gas, power, and even hydro permitting. I think there was a recent interagency agreement on that. Andy, are you following that at all, or?
Less so since oil is cited at the state
Right.
and state capitals, but we need federal coordination as well, and it's actually harder to achieve since we don't have that FERC lead agency portion. It's important that those agencies voluntarily work with each other, and when that process doesn't, it's just a needless delay. We've been encouraged by what we've seen over the last year, but we hope we can make structural changes so that in future administrations we still have that coordination.
And FERC has been charged by our current administration to streamline, if possible, the entire process and work on the federal coordination. I do feel that it is working rather well at this point. Can there be improvements? There can always be improvements, but a part of that is also the early engagement with agencies, getting their coordination and course of agreements laid forth prior to the federal applications.
One of the things you've all touched on is how the various categories of regulatory risk affect market prices. I want to change the focus a little bit and talk about investment risk, the risk that marketers face, the risk that pipeline developers face in developing projects. If you have to identify, Orlando's slide had many, many factors, but if you had to pick two factors that most directly affect the issue of investment risk for natural gas pipelines, for oil and NGL pipelines, and for energy marketers, what would they be?
So I can't leave here without saying two words, Dodd-Frank. I think Dodd-Frank would be, from an energy marketer and a swap dealer, I would say that was probably one, as all of you I'm sure know, but Dodd-Frank, a lot of the banks exited the business, and other players as well. And I think there's still, that creates what I'd call investment risk, but higher costs for those that remain. It also is a plethora of rules, and obviously we want to always be compliant. I would actually extend it even further to say that there's still things working within Dodd-Frank. Will things change? That's in the works today. So I think that uncertainty continues to create, you called it investment risk, I'm going to say higher costs. The second one I would say has to do with the recent requests of the federal government, what I would call to change the rules of the game when it comes to competitive power markets, whether it is the DOE NOPR and subsidies to coal and nukes. You know, that again, that's in the works as well, and we're actually providing comments. So again, that to me would change the way the market works. I mean, we want competitive markets. We want fuel neutrality so that the market will work. So those are the two that if you're an energy marketer, you need to understand what's going on with both of those, as it will impact our business.
Crystal.
From the interstate gas pipeline aspect, I would say tax law and the implications of that, and steel tariffs, both of which are moving very quickly, and perhaps too quickly at this point, to allow the well-reasoned decision-making that is required, and for assessment of the differences and how that's treated amongst different entities. But those would be the two factors that bring risk to our investment for putting additional infrastructure in the ground. And I know there's further panel or discussions later today on the tax implications, and that's forefront of many people's minds.
I saw Rick Smead here from RBN Energy. If we were having this conference and we weren't focused on regulatory and policy issues, and you'd asked exec about his or her thoughts on investment risk, first they'd talk about the competition that's out there. Pipelines competing with each other and other modes for delivering fuels now, and then pipelines competing for expansion projects. RBN has profiled that the fear from the Permian is that you build the pipeline that becomes one pipeline too many. and that your long-term contracts really aren't long-term anymore, and that maybe you shouldn't have made that decision. So they're worried about overbuilding, and they have to factor that in to their prices. But thinking about regulatory and policy issues, as we should be here, we've talked about the permitting process. Any shipper and pipeline has to recognize now that that process is going to take longer and it's going to be uncertain. We talk about steel tariffs. Nobody here in this room can have any idea whether there will be a tariff or a quota on steel. Maya Weber may be here from Platt. She's done a great job covering this, but I think even she doesn't know. Last thing is the FERC environment for liquid pipelines after 2 significant losses. The first was on the rate index process in 2015, which FERC made two changes to the methodology that really changed the index. So as steel costs are going up, as we've talked about, and pipeline safety costs are going up, you have an index that is only half of what we believe the cost change experience in oil pipelines allows it. And then there is the tax hit from FERC on MLP issues in March. And Mark, remember your admonition to not go into the cases. And I know we've got FERC staff here. After $22 billion of investor losses, I was watching CNBC Jim Cramer on Mad Money, and he's asking one of our execs, what's going on? Is FERC anti-pipeline? What does this mean for risks? And the pipeline operator was explaining why this should be okay, but that they're worried about FERC. We're worried about the next index in 2020 and whether some of the methodology changes that FERC made and these rising costs, if you use rate-making data and not accounting data, will that allow pipelines to adequately have an index that recovers costs? And the index is used as escalator clause on lots of long-term agreements. So it's important. Pipelines are watching the FERC environment very carefully for more blows as they think about investments.
At conferences like this, all too often it seems that every panel, and ours is probably not an exception, talks more about risks, what we'd like to see changed by FERC and other federal agencies. From each of your perspectives, is there something you believe FERC is currently doing right to address the concerns of marketers, to address the concerns of natural gas pipelines, to address the concerns of oil and NGL pipelines? We'll have equal time for positivity.
It is always good to be able to say something nice, right? Oil pipelines have added 25,000 miles in the last 5 years, 37,000 miles in the last 7 years. And there's a FERC policy and practice that has really helped on that. When pipeline operators and shippers are negotiating the contracts that underpin new expansion, they sometimes develop novel issues in their tariffs. They want to know if FERC is going to be okay with that. So through the petition for declaratory order process, or PDO, they will ask, FERC, you're going to be okay before we start investing a lot of money? And that process has worked. FERC has been able to bless many of these innovative tariff treatments that shippers and pipelines have wanted, and they've been able to do it on a timely basis, and that has contributed to the expansion. There are FERC staff here who have helped on those PDOs. Thank you.
I would second that. I think the PDO process has worked. We have used that for some very critical decisions here in the last couple of years relative to the Rockies Express pipeline. And beyond that, I do think that the current policies and the current policy statement does work. I do understand that it's been, what did we say, 18, 19 years since it's been looked at. And we support looking at it. We just ask that the inquiry listens to all of the responses and that we make very well-reasoned decision-making and not any hasty decisions.
Yeah, from my perspective, two very clear things that I want to commend the Commission on. One, again, with the review of the tariff and rates, I think is really turned up over the last couple of years, which I think is good. Return on equity on the pipelines and reviewing that. And the second one is as an energy marketer, price reporting transparency, which actually I testified back in July of 17 in front of the FERC. and I was on a panel. And so, and with safe harbor provisions and other things that the FERC is looking at, and I really, from the market, appreciate the fact that they did take action, and things have really improved.
Let's give FERC a break for a minute. One of the things that people, whether it's in a rate case, in comments, or otherwise, frequently talk about, one of the things in pipeline developers and sometimes even midstream and producers have been talking about for years, is PIMSA. And the PIMSA process, expansion of the PIMSA process. Andy and Crystal, from your perspective, is the PIMSA process working? Does it need to be fixed? And if so, how?
I would say that it is working, similar to what we're encroaching upon with FERC and that regulatory aspect. PHMSA is assessing all of the rules as well, and we support doing that. Again, it's the same theme. We ask for well-reasoned decision-making. There are a number of things that many operators do out there to maintain safe pipelines. Safety is of the utmost importance to us, for our personnel, and for the public. And we consider ourselves a very good operator that conducts many of the things that PHMSA would like to see. It's unfortunate that those things have to become regulated and monitored, because they're not always done by everyone, which just brings in incremental costs, even beyond the cost incurred from performing those actions, as we already do today, but then defending that we're performing those actions, tracking that we're performing those actions. So time and cost associated with that, which really just collectively adds up back to the consumers.
Boy, pipeline safety is a top priority for liquid pipelines. If you had executives here, or small group, even if you weren't here, they'd say that. Pipeline safety continues to improve. We worked with PHMSA and some safety advocate stakeholders on what are some meaningful metrics to help the public understand the pipeline safety record the best. And we settled on pipeline incidents impacting the public and the environment. And there's some specific definitions for that. You can find that on the PHMSA webpage. We use PHMSA data for this. So incidents impacting the public and the environment for liquids decreased 19% over the last 5 years. And that's coming after significant gains on integrity management from starting in the last decade from modern integrity management regulations. When you drill down one level further, incidents impacting the public and the environment that have failure causes attributed to integrity management, inline inspections and repairs, those are down 35% over the last 5 years. PHMSA regulations are comprehensive. PHMSA inspections and audits are thorough. For the most part, Crystal intimated, PHMSA regulations are properly focused on risk management and engineering principles. We think it's important that PHMSA regulations continue to push us and allow for innovation in inline inspection and integrity management. Pipeline operators don't wait for PHMSA regulations. We continue to do preventative, proactive inspections using inline inspection, latest technology. We do preventative maintenance to address an issue before it becomes a problem. 24/7 monitoring from control rooms so that any issue, if it happens, is recognized. And then finally, emergency response, working with first responders so that we're ready. We've got a series of initiatives in our Pipeline Safety Excellence Strategic Plan available at aopl.org. And as long as we can continue to improve safety, we should be able to increase public support. But it's important to recognize that, again, as Crystal mentioned, this is becoming more and more expensive. These tools are becoming sophisticated. The tools themselves are expensive, and they find more issues for a pipeline operator to address. We want pipeline operators going out and looking at those issues so that they don't become problems. But that means more spending.
Well, we've reserved some time for questions from the audience, and this is the time for that. I think we have some handheld mics. Oh, this room can't be shy.
Peter.
Hi, this is for Orlando, but maybe for the others too. Moved to California, land of the extremes, let's say it that way. And I see the environmental movement looking at natural gas not as a bridge, as we used to term it only a few years ago, but as the new coal. They want no part of new natural gas generation. My question to you is, what do you do to counter that? I mean, we all know that natural gas plants emit, a very small fraction of NOx and SOx, much lesser fraction of CO2 than coal. But I don't see the message really getting out there, and I'm wondering what you all are doing and what you suggest might be done better to get that message out.
It's a great question. And actually, as chairman of Natural Gas Supply Association, it's actually a question that I'm sure I just became a month ago. I'm sure I'm going to get that question a lot. The way I'd answer it is, when you talk about reliability and the resiliency of natural gas, we have not, as an industry, I think we can do a better job explaining it. So whether it's wind or solar, you need gas. If you want to make a state all renewables, you're going to need gas to sit in there and be there when wind and solar is not. We have to send the message of the abundant supply. There's the clean component of it, which I think actually people do are getting more familiar with the story. But it all, when you think about the concern or the issues that are out there today, it's about do we have enough infrastructure? Again, in New England, I think for one, do we have enough infrastructure do you see, again, you see the coal piles sitting there, so you visibly can see it. It's getting the story about the reliability and the fact that, yeah, gas it's abundant and we can come from different ways to get it to your plant, or if you're an industrial, whatever. So I think there's more to the story. I would think it's about the abundant supply, it's about the reliability and how the market, how the physical market works. And then also one missing piece for me has always been, I'm not really sure how many understand, when you think about the natural gas market, how it prices, how it, the options that are provided to a customer, whether it's short-term or long-term. You have risk management opportunities as well if you're a consumer. I mean, I think there's a component of that as well that we haven't done a really good job of.
Yeah, I would say, seconding what you say, and then adding to that public outreach, education through our industry groups as to the resiliency, and unfortunately, we may have to hit some of those difficult times for that to really be understood, where renewables, we support their growth and their place in the marketplace, but at this point in time, they are not able to handle the overall demand. They're not able to handle it on a 100% of the time reliable basis, and hitting that actual occurrence and educating the public about what that means is necessary.
And if it's a challenge for natural gas, of course, Peter, it's even harder for oil, right? We're not the bridge fuel, that's sexy, but we're the fuel that people need, hundreds of millions of us every day, right? Every once in a while, I like to go on the NADA, National Association of Auto Dealers, something like that. Look at their market beat and see what people are buying today for cars. Because Tesla stock's exciting, and you hear discussions about electric vehicles. The most recent month that was reported, 96.7% of the cars purchased today are using oil, are using gasoline and diesel. When you add hybrid, gasoline, electric, it's 98.6%. So today, Americans are deciding that the way they want to move around, to get to work, to drop the kids off, is gasoline-powered, diesel-powered cars. So as long as that's happening, we're going to need pipelines to bring it in the cheapest way, the safest way. But the communications challenge is important. It's been an expanding part of our mission at AOPL. American Petroleum Institute has certainly expanded what they're doing. We need people to recognize that life changes if somehow you can't get that pipeline to you. If that minority that is trying to stop you from having lower costing access to lower costing supplies succeeds. High prices, scarcity, they don't want that in what they're choosing to buy today.
The other point I'd make is, to your point, people want to see facts. They want to see them. So there's a study being done right now to finalize hopefully this year. When you think about the polar vortex of 14, when you think about Harvey, when you think about this past January in the cold in the Northeast, how did natural gas perform? People want to know. So in those peak moments, those peak days, where was natural gas? And we were there. The industry was there, and we're going. We need to make sure people want to see the numbers and they want to see the facts. That study's being done.
The people in the middle who are neither our automatic supporters nor they'll never have a chance of being our supporters, they want to know more than just benefits in their daily lives. They want to know that we take safety and environmental protection seriously. We have done opinion research, and that we find that if people recognize that there's proactive inspections, preventive maintenance, 24/7 monitoring, and emergency response, that helps those people in the middle who are listening to them and us become more comfortable. We have to carry that safety message. None of us are embarrassed by environmental protection. It's a huge priority. We have to talk about it. That's what people want to hear, and we have a good record.
Hi, good morning. Elliot Roseman with the United States Energy Association. So the question I have actually is a follow-on to the comments that were just made. And you had on your slide, Mr. Alvarez, one of the interdependencies was the interdependency of the fuels with the electric power markets. And so I'd like to ask about the extent to which there is coordination currently, or there should be, between fuel suppliers, gas suppliers, oil suppliers, and electric power companies. We've seen cases like the Aliso Canyon, for example, in California, with the storage issues there as well. So there's clearly an interdependence there. But what kind of conversations are you having with power companies or power generators? And as part of resiliency or resilience planning, should there be a coordination and even a direct linkage between fuel supply and power supply in that process?
Okay, I'll take it. So there were a few questions there. One was the communication between the fuel supplier and the power plant. So as an energy marketer, and I'm speaking from that perspective only, is we absolutely, our customers, whether it's a straight, integrated utility or whether it's an independent power producer, we discuss, here's your natural gas supply, here's your different options on how you can buy it. If you have different pipelines coming into your plant, obviously backup, people want more options. So we do have those conversations. You can go down the road of asking whether these plants have long-term transport capacity. Will they take long-term transport? That's the key, right? The capacity is there. The pipeline is there in a lot of cases. It's for some of these power plants, they stepping out and taking firm transportation capacity for a longer term. That's how you get the stability and that's how you get the gas in every day. It's not an infrastructure issue in most cases. So yeah, those conversations are had every day is the way I would leave it. I don't know if others.
Yeah, I would say that we are fairly well coordinated from a commercial standpoint. Our pipelines are serving some power plants and continuing to do so. We believe it's a very reliable service to the power plants. There's been some discussions over the last several years on the further coordination of the cycles between pipelines and the power grid. It's working. Are there improvements that could be made? I imagine there's always opportunity for improvement. But pipeline operators are there, the pipelines are there, and generally we appreciate the long-term transport. That always brings greater stability to a power plant. But being connected to a gas pipeline is the first step, and the supply is there and can be drawn upon, and operators work with the power grid to keep everything functioning during polar vortex aspects, power draws. We're good partners in that regard to make performance work.
The relationship's a little different on the oil side. We're customers from the power station. I see Rich Meyer thinking about electric co-ops. We're big customers. In some co-ops, we're the biggest. And so there's an absolute need for that type of integration. And I talked about in natural disasters when the power's out, we're ready. We're working with government and asking, hey, can you please put oil pipeline pump station at the high level for restoration of service, because there are millions of downstream customers that are going to need those products. So that integration is built into the market today. And then thinking about some of the winter New England issues we had this year where there wasn't enough gas needed. Fuel oil is a peaking fuel, and the New England ISO showed that proved pretty important on keeping the lights on for a lot of New England.
We've got time for one last question. Who's feeling game?
Thank you. I was wondering about the lack of discussion of any federal-state issues. And Mr. Alvarez mentioned Kinder Morgan in another context, but probably the hottest one is north of the border, three-way contest having to do with the Trans Mountain pipeline of Kinder Morgan's between Alberta and British Columbia. And you have the federal government, Alberta government, and the British Columbia government. Do we have any comments on that? Would be interesting. But do we have those kinds of issues in the states below the border that you're considering or concerned about?
Boy, what an episode that is right now for the Trans Mountain pipeline. I said that the approval process for pipelines needs to be allowed to work. What's really sad about this is it did. The federal government of Canada approved that pipeline. The province of Alberta approved that pipeline. The province of British Columbia approved that pipeline. Yet the current regime in BC is trying to tie that up in court. There are people who are sharper than me on the arcane issues of the roles between a province and the federal government in Canada, where the province is pretty powerful. But they approved that pipeline. That needs to be able to work. Of course, we have gas pipeline parallels here. Boy, these projects are expensive. They're hard to do. Once you get through that process, you should be able to build. There's people who depend on that. There are millions of people in Calgary right now who are suffering because they can't get their product to market. The tax revenue that Alberta and Canada would be able to get from that pipeline are tremendous. What a loss.
Thank you all very much. We appreciate it.